On April 14, 1935, a wall of dust 1,800 meters high moved across the Oklahoma Panhandle at roughly 100 kilometers per hour. People standing in open fields watched the sky turn from yellow to orange to brown to complete black in under 4 minutes. Noon became midnight. Children walking home from school lost sight of their own hands. Families sealed door frames with wet rags and still found their children's teeth gritty with Kansas in the morning. The storm moved 300 million tons of topsoil in a single afternoon, enough to bury the entire city of Denver under a meter of dirt. It reached Washington, D.C. the following day and darkened the sky there too, while a USDA scientist named Hugh Hammond Bennett was already sitting in front of a congressional committee asking for money to stop exactly this from happening. He had published the warning 7 years earlier. The plowing that produced the storm had accelerated every single year after he published it. First thing in the file: topsoil is not dirt. It is the biologically active upper layer of soil, built over thousands of years by decomposing plant matter, root systems, and microbial activity. Before the first steel plow reached the southern plains, the land was covered by a mixed grass prairie that had evolved specifically for that environment. I traced what the pre-settlement ecology of the region looked like through the botanical survey literature and the journals of Army surveyors and naturalists who had crossed the southern plains in the mid-19th century. Those accounts consistently describe a sea of grass that absorbed rainfall, supported enormous bison herds without visible deterioration of the ground cover, and recovered from periodic drought within a single growing season, because the root mass beneath the surface remained intact regardless of what happened above it. Lieutenant James Abert, surveying the region in 1845, wrote that the grass was so dense and the soil so firmly bound by root structure that his horses struggled to break the surface at a walking pace. The dominant grasses, buffalo grass, blue grama, side oats grama, had root systems reaching 2 meters deep, knitting the surface layer to the subsoil beneath it in a continuous biological mat. Those roots held during drought, held during wind, held during the fire cycles that had moved across the prairie for millennia. The land had been producing and retaining topsoil for roughly 10,000 years before anyone put a plow to it. When you break that root mat, you sever the only thing holding the surface layer in place. On the southern plains, with its history of drought and its average wind speeds of 40 to 60 kilometers per hour, exposed soil does not stay exposed for long. It moves. What it looks like when it moves at scale is documented in the survey photographs that federal teams took across the affected region between 1934 and 1938. I looked through the collection. Fence posts that had stood at 1 meter above the ground were visible at 10 to 20 centimeters, the rest buried in drift. Farm equipment sat half submerged in dust dunes that had built up against the windward side of buildings overnight. In some areas of southwestern Kansas, the drifts reached 6 meters. Houses were abandoned not because the storms had blown them away, but because the soil had piled up against them until the windows were at ground level. The land had not simply lost its topsoil. In the worst affected areas, it had been rearranged into a different topography entirely, one that bore no relationship to the fields that had been planted there a decade before. Farmers returning to their land after the worst storms found that the soil depth markers they had driven into the ground before the drought showed net losses of 8 to 12 centimeters of surface material in a single season. That material was not somewhere else on the same farm. It was in Chicago, on ship decks in the Atlantic, or deposited in the committee rooms of Washington, D.C. Second thing in the file. In 1928, the United States Department of Agriculture published a circular titled Soil Erosion, a National Menace. The lead author was Hugh Hammond Bennett, a soil scientist who had spent 25 years in the field measuring what happened to farmland when native vegetation was stripped. The document named the mechanism. It gave wind speed thresholds at which surface soil becomes airborne. It described the relationship between drought duration and the depth of soil loss. It mapped the regions of greatest vulnerability. The southern plains appeared prominently. The circular was a published USDA document, on file in the same department that administered the country's agricultural programs. So the mechanism was known before the disaster. That doesn't explain why the disaster happened anyway. I cross-referenced the USDA's own acreage records for native grassland conversion on the southern plains between 1910 and 1930. 32 million acres. That is the USDA's own figure for how much of the deep-rooted native prairie the department's records show was plowed under in those 20 years. The rate was still climbing in 1928, the year the warning was published. You'd assume a government agency publishing a warning about the consequences of an accelerating land use practice would also be reviewing the programs it ran that were driving that practice. The gap this case opens on is the distance between those two documents, the warning and the acreage records, and what that distance cost the 3.5 million people eventually displaced from the region the paper had already identified as the highest risk zone on the continent. So here's the actual question in this file. Not what caused the Dust Bowl. The physical mechanism has been understood since it happened. The question is what it means that the institution responsible for both warning about this outcome and administering the policy environment that produced it ran those two functions in parallel, in separate rooms, for the better part of a decade, before anyone made them look at each other. Two documents, same agency, same decade. I haven't shown you both of them yet. The soil scientist grew up on a farm in North Carolina and had been watching erosion turn productive farmland into gullied waste since his earliest field assignments in the 1900s. By the time he co-authored the 1928 circular with his colleague, W.R. Chaplin, he had collected soil surveys from hundreds of farms across the American South and Midwest, documenting what unanchored surface soil does when conditions turn against it. The circular was not a theoretical projection. It was the written summary of evidence he had been accumulating for over 2 decades. The Southern Plains section was specific. The soil scientist identified the region as carrying the highest concentration of newly plowed land in the country, the highest average annual wind speeds in the country, and the most variable rainfall pattern in the country. He described the consequence of those 3 conditions coinciding during a multi-year drought not as a possibility, but as a sequence. He used the word catastrophic. The circular also contained recommendations, a federal program of contour plowing instruction, a system of technical assistance to farmers wanting to establish grass cover on highly erodible land, and a call for a formal review of federal programs that were promoting cultivation on land the survey data classified as too fragile for sustained row crop agriculture. Those recommendations were noted, filed, and acted upon in no systematic way over the following 7 years. The soil scientist continued to submit requests for funding and authority to implement them. Each request was considered against the backdrop of a federal agricultural policy whose primary stated goal was maximizing production, and each request was deferred. The human scale of what that sequence produced on April 14th is preserved in survivor accounts collected by federal relief workers in the weeks that followed. I read through the compiled testimony. Families described the wall arriving with a sound like distant thunder that grew into a sustained roar. Birds flew ahead of it. The static charge the storm carried was strong enough to stall car engines and to knock people off their feet. One account describes a man trying to walk from his barn to his house, 50 meters, a route he had walked thousands of times, who lost his bearings in the complete blackout and was found the next morning dead of suffocation, 15 meters from his own front door. The medical term the era's physicians used was dust pneumonia, fine particulate matter filling the lungs over hours or days, particularly lethal in children and the elderly. Estimates of deaths directly attributable to the respiratory effects of the dust storms across the decade run to several thousand. The precise number depends on how broadly the cause of death is defined, and that counting methodology is one of the genuinely unresolved questions in the medical history of the period. The storms were arriving on top of an economic collapse that had already been in progress for years before the worst of the dust. I pulled the farm income data for the Southern Plains counties from the agriculture census records. Average net farm income in the Oklahoma Panhandle in 1930 was approximately $340 per farm household. By 1932, it had fallen to $66. Farm families who had taken on debt during the 1920s to buy tractors and expand onto new land were now producing wheat they sold for 28 cents a bushel against loans that had been financed when wheat was selling at $1.50. Foreclosure rates in the hardest-hit counties ran to 30% in some years. Many of the 3.5 million people who ultimately left the region did not leave because the storms were unlivable, though many were, but because the economics of staying had become arithmetically impossible. The storm was the visible catastrophe. The debt structure was the invisible one that had been building since the wartime expansion, and it ensured that even farmers who wanted to adopt soil conservation practices often couldn't, because the bank holding their operating loan required them to plant every available acre to maximize yield, regardless of what that meant for soil stability. The storms of April 1935 were not the first. They were the largest. Between 1932 and 1936, the USDA's own Weather Bureau counted more than 350 major dust storms across the Southern Plains. The spring of 1934 had produced a single storm that deposited an estimated 350 million tons of plains soil on the eastern seaboard. Ships in the Atlantic 300 kilometers off the coast of New York reported dust on their decks. In Chicago, 12 million pounds of soil fell in a single day. These were not regional weather events. They were the export of a landscape that was dissolving. I wasn't looking for the next part of this file when I found it. I was checking the USDA's internal assessment reports from 1936 to see what the department was documenting about actual soil loss versus what the 1928 circular had projected. What those reports recorded was approximately 850 million tons of topsoil lost annually from the Dust Bowl region at the peak of the crisis. The circular had not given an explicit regional projection, but the soil scientists' national figures from the early 20s, before the worst of the conversion had occurred, were now being exceeded in one region alone. The 1936 assessment was reading like a confirmation of the 1928 warning, produced by the same agency, 7 years too late to stop anything. The official framing of the Dust Bowl and the political discourse of the 1930s rested on two explanations I want to test against the record. The first was drought, a natural event, nobody's fault. The second was farmer ignorance or recklessness, the idea that settlers had not understood the consequences of breaking the prairie sod. Both have partial support. The drought was real. Without it, the loosened earth might not have gone airborne on that scale. The farming practices did strip the protective grass cover. But neither explanation, taken alone, addresses the structure of how 32 million acres ended up under the plow in the first place. I dug into the mechanism. During the First World War, the Federal Food Administration, a government body, ran a sustained public campaign to increase grain production under the slogan, "Food will win the war." The program guaranteed wheat prices at $2.67 per bushel in 1917, more than double the pre-war price. A farmer who had been selling wheat at $1 a bushel and was suddenly offered $2.67 had an obvious incentive to plow every available acre. Federal agents from the USDA's Cooperative Extension Service traveled through rural counties demonstrating deep plow techniques and advising expansion onto previously uncultivated grassland. The Homestead Framework and federal land policy had already made that land available. The price guarantee made breaking it economically rational. Then the war ended. Wheat prices fell from $2.67 to under 30 cents a bushel by 1932. Farmers who had taken on debt to buy equipment and expand their operations were now trapped. They had to keep producing at volume to service the debt, even as prices had collapsed, which meant continued plowing of marginal land that was already showing signs of erosion. The men and women who had broken the Southern Plains sod were not acting irrationally at any step. They were responding to a price signal the government had created, using techniques the government had promoted, on land the government had made accessible. The narrative of ignorant farmers holds individuals responsible for a structural failure whose architecture was federal. What makes the structural argument precise rather than general is the timeline. The Cooperative Extension Service agents who had been advising Plains farmers to plow deeper and faster in the late 1910s were operating under the same departmental umbrella as his Soil Erosion Research Division. Both programs were USDA programs. They had different field offices, different budgets, different mandates, and apparently no formal mechanism for their findings to be tested against each other. His division was producing survey data showing that deep plowing on fragile semi-arid land created erosion vulnerability. The Extension Service's agents were in the same counties, sometimes in the same years, demonstrating to the same farmers how to plow more effectively. The USDA was simultaneously the agency warning about the consequences of rapid grassland conversion, and the agency running training programs that accelerated it. That structural fact is not in dispute in the historical literature. What is disputed is whether it represented a failure of coordination, a failure of departmental leadership, or a more fundamental feature of how institutions manage contradictory mandates. The scale of what that contradiction cost is legible in the population records. The census data for the 5 southernmost Plains states, Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, shows a net outmigration of approximately 3.5 million people between 1930 and 1940. Not all of that migration was driven directly by the dust storms. The Depression was a national phenomenon, and economic migration was happening across the country. But the Plains counties with the highest dust storm frequency show outmigration rates roughly 3 times those of adjacent counties with lower erosion, which suggests the soil loss was the proximate cause for a substantial fraction of those departures. The majority of the migrants were agricultural families who had invested everything they had in land that was literally blowing away. Many settled in California, where their arrival, documented in Steinbeck's fiction and in the Farm Security Administration photographs Dorothea Lange and others took at migrant camps, became one of the defining images of the 1930s. What those images don't show is the document in the USDA archive that described the mechanism that produced them, 7 years before the first camp was established. Quick aside, because the document this case has been building toward since the first paragraph is next. Back to the file. If you're drawn to what the official record says about itself when its own documents are placed side by side, Subscribing puts more of these in front of you. The congressional hearing that produced the Soil Conservation Act of 1935 was not his first attempt to make this case to legislators. He had been requesting a permanent federal soil conservation program since the early 1920s through Republican and Democratic administrations alike. Each request had been deferred. A temporary soil erosion service had been established under the Interior Department in 1933, but on a short-term budget with no permanent mandate. What changed in April of 1935 was not the argument. The evidence was the same evidence the 1928 circular had presented. What changed was that the physical consequence of ignoring that evidence arrived in the committee room while the argument was being made. I read the congressional transcript from those April sessions. He had been testifying for several hours when the dust front that had traveled from Kansas and Oklahoma reached Washington. Accounts from the session described the room dimming perceptibly. A senator got up and went to the window. The investigator, whose aides had been tracking the storm's eastward movement, and who had reportedly extended his testimony to ensure the timing would coincide, said something to the effect that what was darkening the sky outside was the same process he had been documenting and warning about since the 1920s. The Soil Conservation Act passed both chambers within the week. The president signed it on April 27, 1935, 13 days after Black Sunday. What that 13-day sequence establishes is that the barrier to action had not been lack of evidence. The evidence had been available and formally documented since at least 1928. The barrier had been institutional priority. A dust storm that literally filled the room got the hearing that 7 years of circulars had not. The Soil Conservation Service that Bennett built in the months following the Act's passage moved quickly on the ground-level work his division had been developing for years. By the end of 1935, field offices had been established in over 200 counties across the affected region. The technical program was specific and practical. Contour plowing to reduce runoff and wind exposure. Strip cropping that alternated bare soil crops with grass cover. Windbreak tree lines planted perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction. And the direct payment of government funds to farmers who agreed to take highly erosion-prone land out of cultivation entirely. That last program, paying farmers not to plant, was institutionally novel and politically controversial, but it was the most direct intervention available. If the root of the problem was exposed soil, the fastest solution was to stop creating more of it. By 1940, the acreage under Soil Conservation Service management across the southern plains had reached over 40 million acres. The worst of the dust storms had subsided, in part because the drought broke, and in part because the ground-level program was working. Now, the two documents. The 1928 circular, page 7. The soil scientist described the southern high plains as a zone where the removal of native vegetation, combined with the region's characteristic drought cycles and sustained wind patterns, creates conditions under which surface soil loss during any extended dry period would be severe and potentially irreversible. He cited wind speed thresholds above 40 kilometers per hour on unanchored soil, at which fine particles become airborne. He named the rate of native grassland conversion already underway. He used the word catastrophic to describe what would happen when drought, exposed soil, and sustained wind coincided over a multi-year period. The USDA Acreage conversion records, 1910 to 1930. 32 million acres of native southern plains grassland converted to cropland. The rate of conversion in 1929, the year after the circular was published, was higher than any previous year on record. The rate in 1930 was higher still. The drought arrived in 1931. The storms began in 1932. The region the USDA's own scientist had described on page 7 of his own agency's 1928 document produced the largest windborne soil events in the recorded history of North America. There is a separate file on this channel on the Soviet Virgin Lands campaign, Khrushchev's program to plow 45 million hectares of Central Asian steppe for grain production, launched in 1954. Soviet agronomists published internal reports in the early 1950s warning about wind erosion on that class of semi-arid grassland. The warnings were noted, and the plowing proceeded. By 1963, dust storms across Kazakhstan were destroying harvests on the newly converted land at a scale that forced the program into a fundamental redesign. Soviet agricultural teams then adopted many of the soil conservation techniques the USDA's own Soil Conservation Service had developed after 1935, based on work the soil scientist had begun in the 1920s. The warning, the expansion, the dust, the redesign. A different country, a different decade, the same institutional sequence. Worth pulling if this one stays with you. Back to this file. I cross-referenced what became of those two parallel mandates within the USDA after the Soil Conservation Act passed. The Soil Conservation Service he directed did build a genuine program. Contour plowing, windbreaks, strip cropping techniques, field-by-field extension work in the worst affected counties. By 1940, the worst of the dust storms had subsided, partly because the drought had broken and partly because the new practices were taking hold on enough acreage to matter. What I found in the post-1935 correspondence, however, was a record of continued tension between the Soil Conservation Service and the USDA's commodity programs, the price support and crop insurance structures that, under the Agricultural Adjustment Act, were still creating economic incentives to maximize planted acreage regardless of soil vulnerability. That tension did not resolve in 1935. It continued. So where does that leave the file? Confirmed on the documented record, the 1928 USDA circular described the mechanism and the vulnerable region with specificity. Between 1910 and 1930, 32 million acres of native Southern Plains grassland were converted to cropland, with the conversion rate accelerating in the years after the circular was published. The drought from 1931 and the dust storms from 1932 through 1938 are documented. 3.5 million people were displaced. The soil scientists testified before Congress in April 1935. The Soil Conservation Act was signed 13 days after Black Sunday, and the Soil Conservation Service operated under his directorship until 1951. All of this is on the confirmed record. What is theorized, with genuine disagreement among historians, is the relative weight of drought, land conversion, and federal policy. Some historians weight the drought heavily, arguing that without the multi-year precipitation failure, the plowing alone would not have produced a crisis of that scale. Others weight the federal incentive structure, the wartime price guarantees, and extension service promotion of deep plowing, arguing it was the driver that made the land vulnerable before the drought arrived. The most defensible reading holds both as necessary, and neither is sufficient, with the policy structure determining the degree of vulnerability and the drought determining the timing. What is genuinely unresolved is what was happening inside the USDA between 1928 and 1935. The internal correspondence from that period has been archived and is partially accessible. What I found was a record of repeated requests from his division for formal policy review, and a record of those requests being deferred. What I did not find was any documented discussion at a senior level of the contradiction between the circular's findings and the extension programs continuing to promote the land use practices the circular described as catastrophic. That conversation, if it happened, left no trace in the files I could access. What I believe Having read the circular, the acreage records, the survivor testimony, the congressional transcript, and the internal correspondence, is this: the Dust Bowl was not a surprise. It was a documented projection that became a documented outcome, with a 7-year gap between the two documents and 32 million acres of exposed soil filling the space between them. The request to close that gap had been filed. The request had been deferred. The dust finally made the argument that the filing system had failed to make for 7 years. Modern satellite monitoring of soil cover across the southern plains shows that the counties losing the most surface material in the 1930s have never recovered their pre-settlement soil depth. A centimeter of topsoil takes roughly 1,000 years to form naturally. What left in those storms is not coming back on any human timescale. The federal commodity support programs that replace the wartime price guarantees as the dominant federal influence on plains land use still create economic incentives for planting on marginal land that the USDA's own Natural Resources Conservation Service, the direct successor to the Soil Conservation Service, has identified as vulnerable to the same mechanism. The documents are still in the same building. They are still pointing in different directions. There is a second structural problem building beneath the southern plains that the Soil Conservation Service's successors have been documenting since the 1970s. The Ogallala Aquifer, the underground water reservoir that now makes much of the region's agriculture possible, is being depleted at a rate that exceeds its natural recharge rate by a factor of roughly 10 to 1 in the heaviest use areas. Some sections of the aquifer have already dropped below economically viable pumping depth. The farmers drawing from it are responding to a price and subsidy structure the federal government has created, using techniques the government has promoted, on land where the government's own scientists have published the projections for what the depletion curve looks like at the current rate of extraction. The 1928 circular is no longer the only document of its kind in the departmental archive. If working through a stack of unresolved files is your kind of thing, subscribing means you won't miss the next one.